It was 6:07 a.m., and the world outside was just beginning to stir. I had woken up still heavy with the remnants of sleep, the kind of fog that clings stubbornly to your brain until your first sip of coffee kicks in. My hand wrapped around the travel mug I'd filled before bed, its warmth barely reaching my fingers, as I shuffled out the front door onto the driveway. The morning air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of dew-damp grass and freshly watered flower beds from my neighbors' yards. Somewhere nearby, birds were chirping a gentle chorus, welcoming the new day. The sun was shy, only just beginning to edge its golden light over the rooftops, casting long shadows that stretched lazily across the pavement. I had walked this route countless mornings before, out the front door, down the few steps, past the old maple tree that always seemed to change color a little earlier than the others in fall, and right to my electric vehicle's charging station. It was a small, quiet ritual, something I never thought twice about. But this morning, something was different. There it was. My EV charger, the sleek black unit I'd personally installed last year, fully permitted and compliant with city codes, was no longer just a functional piece of technology attached to my house. It was a target. Dangling from the side, panel where the charging port lived was a clunky, rusted padlock. It wasn't just locked. It looked as if someone had tried to send a message. The hasp holding the lock was crooked, a poor attempt at installation that looked both amateurish and spiteful. The rust and scratches on the lock showed it had been out there for a while, not just a prank. Next to it, taped with bright pink duct tape that stuck out like a sore thumb on the otherwise muted tones of the charger and my gray siding, was a laminated sign. The font was, of all things, Comic Sans. I rolled my eyes at the childishness of it. The sign read, "Reserved by HOA order, property of guarantee." For a moment I stood frozen, my breath catching in my throat. Surely this wasn't real. I blinked hard, rubbed my eyes, even stepped back to squint. But no, there was glue residue around the edges of the sign, bent and half-stripped screws holding the lock's hasp in place, and unmistakable smudges of pink nail polish smeared across the side. I was not dreaming. I was being electrically mugged. And by Karen. To truly understand the magnitude of my anger, you need to know Karen. Karen wasn't just any neighborhood busybody. She was the unofficial sheriff of our cul-de-sac, a woman armed with a clipboard like it was a badge of authority, and a rule book she wielded like a weapon. She patrolled the neighborhood with the intensity of a hawk hunting prey, her gaze sharp and relentless. You could tell she had way too much free time on her hands and absolutely zero sense of humor. Her yard was a fortress of rules and signs, the most infamous being her "No Jogging on Grass" placard, nailed to a stake right in the middle of her perfectly manicured lawn. It was the kind of sign that made everyone in the neighborhood roll their eyes, but no one dared to question it openly. Karen's mailbox was a story in itself. She had installed a high-tech sensor that would send her a text message every time someone opened it. Yes, her mailbox. It pinged her phone so she could track when and who accessed her mail. Some might call that paranoia. Karen called it smart security. Her obsession with control didn't stop there. I still remember the time she fined one of our neighbors for flying a decorative flag because it was waving too enthusiastically in the wind. She claimed it violated community aesthetic standards. The poor neighbor fought tooth and nail to keep the flag, but Karen's iron grip on the HOA board meant the fine stood. It was petty, absurd, and borderline ridiculous, but effective. So, when Karen got her new plug-in hybrid vehicle last month and learned she couldn't install a charger on her property without prior HOA approval, it set off something inside her. Instead of waiting or following protocol, Karen decided to use her HOA clout to control everyone else's chargers. And that's how I found my perfectly legal personal EV charger hijacked and locked down. My charger wasn't just any charger. I had personally overseen its installation, getting all the proper city permits and inspections done to ensure it was up to code. It was my own property, on my own land. But Karen didn't see it that way. To her, it was just another piece of technology in the neighborhood that had to be controlled, regulated, and weaponized for her own amusement. She didn't just slap a lock on it. No, she drilled into the side panel, bending the metal cover and scratching the paint like it was some form of vandalism disguised as enforcement. It was personal. You could tell she took satisfaction in the damage, in the greasy fingerprints left all over the unit, as if she'd tried to force her way inside, with tools from a dollar store. I knelt beside the charger, examining every mark, every dent, every little insult. This was more than a petty HOA feud. It was a full-on hijacking of my property. I half expected Karen to jump out from behind a hedge, holding a tray of muffins and waving a restraining order, as if this whole thing were some twisted social event. But no one appeared. Frustrated and on edge, I grabbed my phone and opened the security app I'd installed not just for my own peace of mind, but because after years living in this neighborhood, I'd learned to expect the unexpected. Karen wasn't subtle, not in the slightest. The footage showed her wandering across my lawn just before 3 a.m., wearing a hoodie that swallowed her frame whole, dragging what looked like a diaper bag stuffed full of tools. Trailing behind her was her toddler, decked out in sunglasses and clutching a flashlight like a miniature accomplice in a heist movie. Karen crouched by my charging port and pulled out a power drill. She worked deliberately, hacking at the siding like it was made of drywall. For 15 minutes, she drilled and wrestled with the metal hasp, stopping only once to hand her kid a juice box. It was like watching a bizarre reality TV episode produced by a blend of toddlers and paranoia. The audacity of her actions hit me hard. This wasn't some random vandal or thief. This was a woman who used her HOA power like a weapon, intruding on my property in the dead of night with her child in tow. And the community did nothing. I knew from past experience that calling the HOA would probably be a waste of time. Karen had a strange hold on them, an influence so tight that the board seemed more like her personal fan club than a democratic organization representing all homeowners. But I tried anyway. I sent emails, made phone calls, and eventually showed up at the HOA office in person, armed with the footage on a flash drive and a printed copy of my charger permit. I wanted answers. I wanted accountability. The secretary glanced at the footage, squinted at the printout, then looked up at me with an expression so nonchalant it was infuriating. "So what exactly is the problem?" she asked. "The charger still works, right?" I blinked, struggling to process what I'd just heard. Was she seriously asking if the functionality of my property being tampered with was the only concern? I pressed, "Are you okay with residents installing locks on other people's private property?" She nodded slowly. Karen submitted a temporary requisition for community shared use. It's in the bylaws under emergency power pooling. Emergency power pooling? I repeated, incredulous. For what? A bake sale apocalypse? She shrugged. The president hasn't denied it. Silence equals permission. I felt my blood pressure spike. Karen had wrapped the entire HOA around her finger tighter than the rusty lock on my charger. That night's sleep was impossible. My mind replayed every frame of that security footage, every scratch on my charger, every mocking smirk Karen always wore when she knew she'd won. The idea that the HOA's so-called leadership could just ignore clear property violations made my blood boil. Lying awake in the dark, I stared at my ceiling, feeling helpless and furious all at once. The glow of my phone's screen was the only light in the room, and it illuminated every unanswered email, every phone call that went nowhere. But then a thought cut through the haze. I wasn't just a homeowner. I was a robotics engineer. My day job involved designing autonomous security systems for warehouses, machines that could track, detect, and respond to threats without human intervention. Karen had unwittingly handed me a perfect excuse to get creative. I spent the next 2 days holed up in my garage, surrounded by tools, circuit boards, and cans of spray paint. I sketched, prototyped, and tested, channeling my frustration into a tangible plan. My goal was simple: create a dummy charger, a decoy that looked exactly like my real one, but with a twist. It would be rigged with sensors and a paint delivery system that would activate whenever someone tampered with the lock. I designed the system to use compressed air to shoot a burst of neon pink paint, bright, unmistakable, and hard to miss. The paint was environmentally safe and washable, but stubborn enough that it required at least 10 washes to fully remove. Plus, it glowed under UV light, ensuring any evidence would be impossible to hide. The tech wasn't brand new. I'd developed a similar concept for a warehouse theft deterrent system, but this was my first chance to field test it personally. After 5 intense hours building the dummy shell and wiring up the sensors, I carefully installed it in the exact spot where Karen had drilled into my real charger. I left the original lock on the dummy so it wouldn't raise suspicion, and I temporarily relocated my real charger to the backyard, safely out of Karen's reach. I recorded every step of the installation, narrating the process like a science experiment to have legal evidence if things escalated. Then, I waited. The first 2 nights passed without incident. The neighborhood was quiet, and my phone's motion sensors remained silent. I began to wonder if Karen had finally given up or moved on to other obsessions. But just as I started to relax, my phone buzzed sharply at 2:54 a.m. on the third night. Heart pounding, I grabbed my phone and pulled up the live security feed. There she was, Karen, again in her oversized hoodie, carrying a thermos in one hand and keys in the other. Her toddler was asleep in a stroller beside her, undisturbed by the late-night excursion. She bent down, fumbled with the lock for a few seconds, and then, bam, the paint delivery system activated. A sudden geyser of fluorescent pink paint shot upward, drenching Karen's face, chest, and arms. She shrieked, stumbling backward, losing her balance on the slick paint and her own Crocs. She landed hard on her backside, soaked in bright neon pink from head to toe. The camera caught every second of it. Karen's shriek echoed through the stillness of the early morning, piercing the quiet like a fire alarm. I watched the screen, heart racing, as she scrambled to her feet, paint dripping from her hair and staining her oversized hoodie. Her toddler stirred in the stroller, blinking groggily in confusion. I could almost hear her mind racing, shock, humiliation, and fury all mixing in a volatile cocktail. Her first instinct was denial. She tried wiping paint from her face, smearing it only more. Then, with a sudden burst of rage, she stormed towards the camera, shaking her fists at the invisible eye that had witnessed her humiliation. I could see the unmistakable fire in her eyes, the kind of fire fueled by a wounded ego and a relentless need for control. This wasn't just about a charger anymore. This was about power, dominance, and who got to dictate the rules on this street. But for once, Karen was the one caught off guard. The next morning, word spread quickly. At first I was hesitant to share the footage, worried about stirring up more drama. But I knew I had to protect my property and send a clear message. Karen's reign of terror wasn't going to continue unchecked. I posted the video on our neighborhood social media group, along with a calm, factual explanation of what had happened. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Neighbors who had previously stayed silent started sharing their own stories of Karen's overreach, complaints about unnecessary fines, arbitrary rules, and constant surveillance. Others expressed relief that someone had finally stood up to her. Even those who weren't tech-savvy were impressed by the creative justice served. It became a turning point, sparking conversations about HOA power, boundaries, and respect. Karen didn't take the public humiliation lightly. Within days, she retaliated with a new wave of petty harassment. Anonymous notes taped to my door demanding I remove the illegal paint trap, threats of fines, and even attempts to block access to my driveway by parking her SUV strategically. One afternoon, I found my mailbox vandalized, covered in the same neon pink paint that had drenched her. It was childish, sure, but unmistakably calculated. Despite the provocations, I stayed calm and documented everything meticulously. My engineering mindset kicked in again. I was collecting data, building a case that couldn't be ignored. As tensions escalated, I realized this wasn't just about personal vendettas anymore. Karen was abusing her HOA power, and I needed legal help. I contacted a property attorney who specialized in HOA disputes. Together, we reviewed the HOA bylaws, the emergency power pooling clause Karen had twisted, and the recent incidents. Armed with security footage, documented harassment, and expert testimony, I filed a formal complaint against Karen and petitioned the HOA board for a special meeting. To my surprise, a growing number of neighbors joined my cause. They testified to Karen's pattern of behavior and supported reforms to prevent future abuses. The community's voice became louder, and for the first time, the HOA board seemed willing to listen. After weeks of meetings, hearings, and legal wrangling, the HOA board finally voted to remove Karen from her position. They also passed new regulations clarifying property rights and limiting arbitrary enforcement. I restored my original charger to its rightful place, this time with reinforced security measures, but without the paint trap. The neighborhood felt different, lighter, more respectful. The experience left me exhausted but proud. I had stood up not just for myself, but for the entire community. And as I sipped my morning coffee in peace, watching the sun rise without fear of sabotage, I realized something important. Sometimes, justice needs a little creativity and courage to spark real change.